Welcome to Romance Studies 202, Literature and Culture from Modernism to the Present. I'm very, very happy today to have with me Sally Perret, Professor Sally Perret, who's Professor of Spanish in the Department of Modern Languages at Salisbury University in Maryland. And we're going to be talking about Carmen Laforet's Nada. And we have the English here and the Spanish there. So, Professor Perret, or Sally, if I may, thank you so much again for this being willing to do this conversation. How would you suggest approaching this book?
Well, I actually liked the way you just did. First, thinking about the fact that if we read it in Spanish or if we read it in English. And I love that we discovered that they keep the title in Spanish no matter what. And so I think, as just a point of departure, it's interesting to consider why nada and not nothing. Um, and it's also, I think, important to notice when we think about Carmen Laforet before we really begin how amazing it is that one of the most canonical novels and the very first recipient of the Premio Nadal that today is so important, it was able to publish. And so if you don't, if for those of you that might just be learning about what that means, um, the censorship in Spain during Franco was so severe that there really is a gap where there's literally nothing published inside. In exile, we have several writers, including Juan Ramon Jimenez, a famous poet who did exile from Spain during this terrible civil war and the years of hunger that followed once when Franco took control. And so it's interesting just to consider that. How did this happen? And in my own investigation, I discovered that the censors that actually read the novel were very divided. This novel almost did not get published. One said, oh no, it's bad for morale. And the
Mhm.
other said, nothing happens. It's meaningless. And so they let it publish. And because of that, she remains, Carmen Laforet, remains with us as as a testimony to what we can now better, maybe not better, but differently understand from our perspective, what it was like to live through a fascist dictator and what that does to the average person that's just looking to live. And it's interesting when you say, how do we start? I think the novel tells us how to start. First, there is an epigraph. It's clear this is dedicated to friends and a painter. And we notice that all the names are not typical Castellano names. Neither is Laforet.
Mhm.
So much like the novel will include a little bit of Catalan here and there, we're already starting with a foreignness that would go against what the regime might have wanted. And then, of course, the poem that follows. And just to be brief on that, it's called Nada. So it does make you wonder, maybe that's why she called her novel that. And it is a fragment. And if you look for the whole poem, it's in a similar vein, but there are other images. It is fun to study. So go look it up if you're curious. But Juan Ramon Jimenez, or JRJ, which we might wonder, was that a subtle way to get it through? Because now we all know who JRJ is. But in those years, would the censors have? And then, of course, the poem itself, melancholy as it starts. I'm not really sure what the English translation. Maybe John, maybe you could do us the favor of reading the English that you have in front of you.
Yes, as you say, this is part of the epigraph. Sometimes a bitter taste, a foul smell, a strange light, a discordant tone, a disinterested touch come to our five senses like fixed realities, and they seem to us to be the unsuspected truth.
Thank you for reading that. And I am firmly convinced that that contemplation is what we're meant to experience when we read to a certain extent. Um, Five senses. This
Yeah.
novel is full of realism. It is going to tell us what we hear, smell, touch, taste, and then of course what we feel. We're going to also wonder what that unsuspected, is that what the word was? Unsuspected truth. We're going to wonder, what is that? And the novel is the fact that she uses a fragment, and then the novel itself, some have called fragmented, because you can almost read each chapter as a short story. And though there we will appreciate a progression of time,
Hmm.
and there is a clear beginning and a clear end, there is a coming and a going. Um, each chapter really is fragmented.
Hmm.
So that's how I would want to enter the novel, is knowing that it's going to be fragmented and we need to pay attention to all the details to find out that unsuspected truth.
You've raised so much here, which is fantastic, from the question of the of language and translation to the context. I want to talk a little bit about that context and the question of the politics as well, which is interesting. How did this come out? So the novel is set in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, which brings Francisco Franco to power. He had been supported by the by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and although Spain was neutral during World War II, that's an authoritarian regime that continues right to the 1970s. But it's written, it's set in the aftermath of this civil war, but it hardly seems like full of triumph, right? It pictures Barcelona in particular, which is the where the most of the novel is set, as a place as a place which is grotesque in some ways. It's full of ruins, as full of um, I don't know, these memories that can't be shared, that can't be spoken. It is quite something to think that yeah, this is hardly the way that the regime would want to present itself.
Not only that, but because of memory and comparison and flashback, we're also given and reminded what Barcelona was like. However, really importantly, we can put the pieces together that there was civil war, but the actual references to war uh, are not there. Franco is not really named. And so it's all hinted at. And I think that's why one reader was able to say, oh my gosh, this is bad for us, much like you're arguing. And the other, things were just so bad that this actually didn't seem that bad.
This also makes me think of something else that comes from that fragment of the poem. The notion that in the book, and I know you've written about this too, in some ways you feel the book as much as in some ways, if it doesn't make explicit, as you say, those references, those aren't necessarily explicitly there. You see the signs, perhaps, right? Or you see the traces, but there's it's never sort of articulated as to. But you do have this sense of all those senses, right? Of sight, of touch, of hearing. There's the role of music in the plot, and so on. It's a very sensory book, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. And I do think that's why it continues to be read. And I do think that's why it's produced so many different academic almost debates, perspectives. This novel just doesn't stop giving. There are definitely some that will argue it's political or not. My particular focus was on the materiality, and I noticed that the way that she does or doesn't have access to food in particular, Andrea, really affects her mood and her worldview. And I want to tell a small tidbit about doing the research on this argument or on this article. Um, I noticed that when there was a lack of food, there was more fighting in the house and domestic violence. So I wanted to just write, when people are hungry, they get angry. And the journal that I published with wrote me back. We can't just make a claim like that. So I actually had to go back and do research from 1950s, 1960s science experiments where we could definitively prove, and because nobody would do those experiments now in that way, but we could definitively prove. And so there, I think even when you think about that there are certain things that people take for granted, And until you really, I hope nobody in this that hears this knows, but if you have ever experienced any day without food, it is all consuming. And I think at some point the dirtiness, the fighting, the closed spaces, the the limits that are there are not. Uh, I think, and when Andrea goes to a party and is completely ignored because she's not dressed properly, I think anybody reading it feels that pit in the stomach of this poor girl doesn't have a chance.
I like this reminds me of something we were talking about briefly before. I think you said something like "from nothing comes everything," right? There's a
Mhm.
in one sense this is a book about nothing. Um, Nothing much happens in some senses. These sort of little fragments. On the other hand, it's so full, and it makes me think the house, for instance, the house on the Calle Aribao that Andrea that's comes to. This is the opening of the novel. On the one hand, it's scarcity, right? I mean, they don't have enough to eat, they don't have enough to get by on, but it's also excess. It's just full of furniture and stuff, which in fact one of the characters, Gloria, is sort of trying to sell off to so that they can, occasionally have a little bit of meat on the table. But I'm interested by this sort of it's a tension, but all this uh I don't know, overlap perhaps as well, right? Of scarcity, of nothingness, and excess, just too much stuff as well.
The novel again is full of so many contrasts that we really do get to appreciate everything. And exactly as you say, the house is so full of stuff, and it's almost suffocating. And in fact, it could be argued that at the tragic end of Roman and his decision to take his own life in front of the mirror, he had the most stuff, still kept well, and an illusion of we can still have art, music, and liberty, and we can still be part of covert missions, and him being so tragic, and it just sort of passing. And it's tragic. People are crying. They mention that, but then there's another fragment. We're somewhere else. The fact that and at the end, we know Gloria sells the piano, and that really is the last thing, the big symbol that since Enlightenment has defined a certain way of life where knowledge mattered. That ideal of society that maybe the Republicans thought they were fighting for in all of their bickering and self sabotage that we could also analyze and talk about separately. But the ones that were against Franco, I think they still believed in an idea um, of, of using art and music to achieve something better. And in a way, the novel still does that and captures all that could have been and how it became somewhat always a challenge to humankind, to mankind, if you will, to really think about that the relation to the material and to the role of politics and how much that can. I mean, we it's very interesting because to think about at a time when it was illegal to publish any image of Franco at a banquet because it would show an excess of food
Hmm.
when everybody was starving.
Hmm.
That was illegal, and now we could contemplate struggling economies with leaders that have great Gatsby parties.
So yeah, there's something there about what can and can't be represented, or what can only be, or what can perhaps be represented aslant, right? Or indirectly.
Yes.
That's something that the feeling I often get um, with this novel. You were talking earlier about how this is a book that has generated much criticism, criticism in the sense of critical discussion, many debates, and questions about how to categorize it. For instance, he was talking about whether is it a political novel, is it not a political novel? Even at the very moment that the censors first read it, there was a disagreement about that. I wonder if I wonder if we could talk perhaps about gender, about the role of women in the. I mean, the protagonist, the narrator, is Andrea, is a woman. Um, you've got this, yes, and she comes to this house, which is, oh, I don't know, this sort of squabbling set of family members in which there's all sorts of I don't know, assumptions and abuse to a certain extent along gender lines. How do you see that?
I absolutely love this question because we see so many types of women at once. And we could even ask, is it feminist or not? Which many critics have explicitly argued. But I think beyond that, much like every other discussion, yes and yes.
Uh,
So just much like the characters, because my favorite example is Gloria, because Gloria would have been the woman that would have been a young woman when the Republic seemed possible. She would have gotten the right to vote. She would have gotten the right to be expected, that education was normal, that, but also partying and making music and being an artist or a model was still a acceptable way of being. And then, boom, here comes the censor, and everything that she was once, it was once possible for her day and night, was just taken away. And so there she is, stuck in this house, knowing that, she had to give up all of that to be safe, but she's still the one that's saving the family by selling the things off. In practical terms, her husband is completely emasculated and has zero ability to move forward. The other male character, Roman, takes his own life. And really, the only successful men we see are Elena's father and the other artist buddies who get to have exhibitions and all the things because their parents can pay for it. So we see from the start that everything really has to do with access to money, and gender is related because your only access is marriage, which we see, or black market affairs, which we see. We see the church providing nothing, like la abuela, and then Andrea's wandering her way through. But she's not active. And many critics have noticed that her role as an observer is why it's not necessarily a pro-feminist, active, women have rights. And yet she does continue to go on to work in a law office, and possibly continuing studying in Madrid at the end, with Anna's father, who is very clearly on the side of Franco.
so just, I mean, we're almost out of time.
Of course.
I was hoping that we talk a little bit about that ending. And some, I mean, when she writes, as she leaves, she goes down the steps of the house in the Calle Aribao, which we've seen. We saw the it sort of mirrors the opening where she goes up and she knocks on the door. When she first arrives, she's mistaken for Andrea's mistaken for Gloria by the grandmother and so on. And she says she's thinking back to that experience which we've read, whatever, 240 pages earlier. He says, I didn't have the same illusions now, but the departure moved me as if it were a liberation. I went down the stairs slowly. I felt a strong emotion. I remember this terrible expectation, the longing for life, when I climbed them for the first time. I confusedly hoped for life in its plenitude, joy, deep interest, love. I was taking nothing, nada, from the house on Calle de Aribao. At least that's what I thought then. I wonder if you have any thoughts on. I don't.
I believe that's the unsuspecting truth. That even though she thought she was really leaving to get a better life, and maybe physically she did, in the end, it was also realizing that the battle was over, the dream was over, and there was nothing but resignation. And that's also very depressing. And if you think about Laforet's career in general, she did keep writing, and her next novel, short stories and things, continue to sort of describe the experience of woman, of herself. And I think overall she leaves a very beautiful, even letters, a very beautiful collection that really shows the experience of what it must have been like to at one point think you're going to get to be free in anything, have it taken away, have to get used to that and try to do it anyway. But she did get divorced. She did lose her mind and somewhat die alone, not literally, but somewhat forgotten outside of Madrid. And so it does make you wonder if the thing that she didn't get to take was the opportunity to stay and do something different and change it, bring it back to the way it was. It does beg that question. If it's a memoir of regret, or if it's actually she was happy to be able to finally eat. And that's really all that matters, is that all of us can eat. Can we really judge her?
But she did leave us this extraordinary novel, which we're continuing to talk about even, whatever, 80 years on. Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much for this fascinating and enlightening conversation. I've enjoyed it very much, and for sharing some of your thoughts and ideas about this novel.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.